Welcome everybody to another episode of Iowa State Cyclones live here on the Voice of College Football Network. I'm your host Levi Stevenson, also the man in charge over at After Dark at Cyclone Fanatic After Dark, and we are here today on the first, maybe the first true off-season episode of this show, where we've gotten basically no football news this week, and we can really sit down and kind of take an inventory of kind of where we're at and where we're going. Just the last couple months, every week it's been, for a while there was, me of the season, obviously it was new coach, stuff like that. It was recruiting. It was then it was transfer portal for, a month and a half. And then the schedule came out and all that. And it was a very newsy last couple months. This is the first week that we've had where we basically had nothing. The football team started some spring workouts this past week. Or winter workouts this past week, I should say. But other than that, we really haven't seen much. So this is a good opportunity for us to kind of sit down and talk about kind of where, and just kind of take a state of the program, I guess, if you want to call it that. But what I want to do today is set some goals for 2026. And I wanted to do this in kind of three categories. So I want to set kind of just minimum goals. Like what is the bare minimum that they can accomplish next season for us to feel like this thing is generally speaking pointed in the right direction? You're going in hitting those exact minimum goals. You're going to have some games you felt like you let slip away. You're going to feel like there were some games where maybe you lost big one game, whatever it is. You maybe felt like there was some disappointments in there, but in the right context can still be viewed as a positive, or that things are trending positively in the positive direction. And then basically kind of then realistic goals. Like where can we realistically have our eye without feeling like we're getting ahead of ourselves, but we feel like we're setting fair expectations for this program now that we are, the standard has been raised. We've now become accustomed to being a solid football program that wins on a regular basis. And, we want to be able to maintain that going forward, knowing full well that this season is, will be some level of a rebuilding season. What can we honestly expect to be able to get from this team and feel like we are in a really good spot for 2027? And not feel like we're getting too far ahead of ourselves and not setting ourselves up for disappointment, basically. And then we will move on to stretch goals. These are the goals that we get. If we really want to think big, Iowa State gets a few bounces their way. You just get some plays that go your direction. Some people live up to expectations. Some people, a lot of people exceed expectations, especially in critical positions. And, we can really start to kind of dream big here a little bit and just kind of have some fun with it. So, we will start off and as always, always appreciate comments during the show. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you guys have and field all that type of stuff. So first up, let's start at the very bottom. This is the bare minimum. What needs to be, this is what needs to happen for us to at least like have reason to believe this thing is going in the right direction, or without having us to like reset expectations for what this football program should be, basically. First goal, and I understand these are gonna be, some of these may be like they might feel extreme, or they might feel, that's kind of what these are. This is meant to be towards the extreme low end. And you might disagree, and I'm more than happy to hear the disagreements and listen to your arguments. But minimum goal number 1, 4-8 and trending up in November. It's a really tall graphic. Which I know I just see the comment there from Emphatic Chain saying 6 wins for me next year, and I consider it a success. I'm not saying you're wrong, but what I am saying, there we go, that's better. But what I am saying is that 6-6 is it, while I believe very doable, I don't think you have to be 6-6 for this to be marked in the correct direction. So what I mean by that is, like, let's look back at Matt Campbell year 1 in 2016. Now, obviously, he was taking over. So he was taking over, a worse situation, I guess. Like the roster wasn't very good, but he also had a roster. So I'm actually not sure that we can say that Matt Campbell had a worse situation than Jimmy Rogers, because Jimmy Rogers had to build almost an entire roster from scratch. Now, was he able to sell a better program than Matt Campbell was? Absolutely. No question about it. He was able to sell, like, this place has won. They can win. They want to win. They expect to win, type of thing. So, like, yes, but Jimmy Rogers, I would argue, had a more difficult roster building situation than Matt Campbell did. Even if you add up the 2016, 17, 18 roster building years, even if you combine all of those, I don't think that was as difficult as what Jimmy Rogers had to do as far as assembling a roster this fall or this winter. So, but you look back to 2016, Matt Campbell, they go 3-9, but they're trending up. They're playing good football by the time you get to late October, early November, all that. And we're looking at, like, okay, 2017, I think they can move up. Dukes is here. What's up? Appreciate you guys always for tuning in every week. But you look at 2016, I don't think we look back. We don't look back that as a failure so much as don't look at the record, because the team was better than the record and they were playing really good by the end. And by the time, and it gave them good momentum into the 2017 season. So that's kind of how I think you can view a 4-8 season here. Maybe they take care of their G5 opponents, but you got to play on the road at Iowa. That's tough. And, you have a navigable schedule, but it's not, I mean, there's some, there really aren't any, like, terrible teams in here. Or at least teams I think will be terrible. Iowa's a tough game. Utah was good last year. I think they'll be good again this year. West Virginia wasn't great last year, but they started playing good football towards the end of the year. Like, there's some belief for Rich Rodriguez. They got some nice transfer. Michael Hawkins, the quarterback from Oklahoma. Rich Rodriguez has has really injected a lot of new energy back into that program. They spent a lot of money this winter. I know they're hoping to pay it off. You get them in Ames, which is great. But I don't believe West Virginia is probably going to be a fairly tough out. You got to go on the road to BYU. You got to go on the road to Arizona, which Arizona was much better last year. You have Oklahoma State at home. Now, Oklahoma State, yes, last year was terrible, but they got a new coach. They brought in a bunch of players from North Texas who had a very good offense, including the number one passer in college football last year, Andrew Mestemaker. And I do think they're going to be. Are they a bowl team yet? I don't know. Maybe, but they're not going to be 2-10, 1-11, or whatever the hell they finished last year, and terrible. They're not going to be like horrific next year. They're going to be serviceable, and maybe by the end of October they might be moving the ball pretty well. Then you got to go down to Baylor. They're in a tough situation right now, and Dave Aranda is probably coaching for his job at this point, but I would say doesn't play well in Waco typically. Cincinnati's coming to Ames, again, situation where we may have a guy fighting for his job type of thing, because they lost so much between the portal and graduation last year. Cincinnati lost a ton, but you lost to him last year. You got blown out by him last year, or what felt like a blowout. You're on the road at UCF. Then you've got Kansas State at home. Who knows what the fuck Kansas State's going to be? But by the end of the season, they might be solid. Maybe Colin Klein is the Avery Johnson whisperer. You've got a navigable schedule there, but it's not easy. You can win your 2 G5 games, win a couple of your lesser opponents at home. You get to 4-8. But if you're finishing out and you're playing good football by the time by the time you go down to Waco and you play, let's see, maybe you win Waco, maybe you lose a close one in Waco. You beat Cincinnati at home, and you have a close game with UCF on the road, and then you play Kansas State close type of thing. But Kansas State's a good team. I think you can look at that kind of a 4-8 season and be like, okay, they're playing better football. There's clearly a direction here. We can work with this. And now that you don't have to rebuild an entire roster in December, they can focus on recruiting. They can focus on getting kind of, they can really start building the roster how they want to build it, rather than how they kind of have to build it. So that's number one is a 4-8, and then you're trending up in November, and late October and November. Then on goal number 2, the top 50 defense. That may sound like a lofty goal. Um, that may seem which to contextualize this. When I'm saying top 50 defense, I do not mean like total defense yards per game. I do not mean that at all. What I'm talking about is kind of a combination of, I'm looking at a little bit of like team PFF grades, but I'm also looking at like analytics like EPA, so estimated points added stuff. I'm looking at those more like more the analytical, the metrics. Um, for context, last year Iowa State finished with the 37th offense and the 41st defense. Um, Most people would say the offense wasn't very good. Most people would say the defense was fine. They weren't great, but they were fine. They kind of did what they had to do. Um, I think a top 50 defense is very achievable for this group. And I think that you could argue that that's selling them short, but this is a minimum goal. This is like I would say needs to be a top 50 defense. For context, if you look last year, the 49th defense was Tennessee, and their defense wasn't great. Penn State had the 47th defense. They weren't great. Illinois had the 46th defense. They were fine. Let's see here. Houston had the 40th defense. Northwestern had the 48th. Clemson had the 45th. Like a top 50 defense in terms of EPA is not a high bar to clear, I don't think, especially when you have this defensive staff and you have this, and they have a lot of the guys they were able to bring in, especially the top end guys, Bobby Terrell, Braden Alls, Tristan Exline, Sullivan Schlimgen. They've got guys in that room now, and they brought back guys in Zamir Hawk and Jace Gilbert and Trey Verdon that, I think are going to fit nicely in this thing. I don't think a top 50 defense is a high bar to clear. I don't think that's an unfair expectation to even have at the bare minimum. Like I think offense, you can look at this and be like, well, they have a mobile quarterback gives your offense a fairly high ceiling, but he was a little turnover prone at Arkansas State. You've got your skill positions you're not really sure about yet, especially running back. The offensive line as a whole is a bunch of new guys. So you're trying to piece that thing together. There's like you can look at the offense and say like, okay, there's a potential here that they're very, very mediocre. So Carter says, see, we go 4-8. How bad would the fan reaction be? I think it would be worse than it should be. I think I would say fans now have been conditioned to winning. It was a decade of pretty much, only winning. They only had 2 seasons below 500, and they hit the program record for wins 2 years ago. So there's some expectations here. I hope the fan base is at least smart enough to know that like this was a total reset. Like there's basically nothing left of the Matt Campbell era except for a few players. So it's you almost have to disconnect it entirely from like what your expectations were 2 years ago to what they are now. You have to basically completely disconnect them because there's just nothing. There's almost nothing tying this coming year to last year or to 2 years ago. There's nothing tying them, and so it's just I think some people will react negatively. Just like when Matt Campbell's here and they were winning 10 games. Or they were winning, 8 games last year. They won 8 games last year, and the fan base was like in a free fall. And they lost 4 in a row, and we were all, and everyone was like half. We knew it was because of injuries, but we were all like kind of half panicking. We're like, what the hell? And fan reaction got bad after like the Arizona State game, and they still finished 8-4. So I believe there's the part of this too is that there's a fairly large segment of the Iowa State social media sphere that they grew up, they're in college now. They're just out of college. They've known Iowa State to be a winning program for most of their like conscious lives. If you're just out of college now, you're 22 years old, you were in 6th grade the last time Iowa State was not good. So you don't really know bad Iowa State football. Not really. You might have some early memories of Paul Rhoads, but for the most part, you don't really know what bad Iowa State football is. And that crowd has they have a much shorter fuse, I think, than a lot of older Cyclone fans. And I think those younger fans will start panicking a lot faster. I think the older crowd will be able to sit back and look and say, okay, they're clearly just trying to get this thing together. They're still getting it figured out in September. October, they're starting to take some strides. By mid-October, this offensive line is really starting to piece itself together and you're playing good football. I think an older crowd will be able to appreciate that. But I think the younger crowd, especially, part of it being on social media and just kind of how things are now, I think especially some of the younger crowd will overreact. Absolutely. But, hopefully they control it at least a little bit. Yeah, I mean, worrying about chemistry between the guys is obviously, that's arguably the biggest thing. I think like the raw talent of the roster is there to win as much as they can, which is a weird sentence to say. They like the talent is there to essentially maintain where they were. Like, I don't know if the overall talent level really went down per se, but it's all new people, and you're trying to make them all mesh in a brain, in a system different from where they were last year. So it's just going to take some time. Do I think Terrell can get to 10 sacks? Maybe. The trick, I'll have to see it because my brain is still kind of wired to process stats from the perspective of the 3-3 stack, in which, like, if a half decent pass rusher got to 5 or 6 sacks on the season, that was kind of a big deal. So I got to kind of reset there. But Terrell, I think, could get to 10 sacks. I don't know. That's 10 sacks is kind of a lot. We'll see. I think it's an achievable goal. I would not call it a bare minimum goal, though. Let's go to bare minimum goal number 3. Don't get blown out. That is the only thing, is don't get blown out. And what I mean by blown out is don't lose by 3 or more scores. If you lose by 17, it's kind of whatever. It depends on the situation. But, a 2-score win I can stomach. But, like, there are very few games. Maybe the BYU game you're looking at is like, maybe they like that could be theoretically on the table to get blown out. But if you're rocking a top 50 defense, and if you're rocking a top 50 defense, you really shouldn't get blown out pretty much ever. It happens, but that was one thing that I always appreciated about Matt Campbell's teams, is that they, it happened once in a while, but very rarely did they really truly get blown out, where they were just never really in the game. Lost plenty of heartbreakers. There were a few duds here and there, obviously, but for the most part, Matt Campbell's teams never really got blown out, and they were always in the game. And I think a bare minimum is that they should maintain that standard, is that they are not getting blown out. Like I said, I can if it's a 28-14 type of thing or a 31-14 type of thing, like, depends on the context, but I can probably stomach something like that. Like, it's okay. I understand. But if we see a 42-10 or some bullshit like that, like that's not going to fly. Yeah, there might be a random game where we get crapped on. It could be BYU, could be Utah, could be any one of those. But right now, I think it is a fair thing to say is just don't get blown out.